More migrants have been trying to cross the Channel from France to England this morning, despite the deaths of 12 people yesterday when their dinghy capsized. A pregnant woman and 6 children were among the dead. Up to 65 people were rescued.
14,000 attempted crossings of the Channel this quarter. The system is pushed to its limits, and nearly 1,900 border force officers are now formally stating that Britain's border crisis is being kept from public view. This is not a political debate. This is the frontline speaking. They claim the government is revising the narrative as quickly as boats arrive. For months, ministers have assured the public that Channel migration is under control. Yet, within Dover, officers report a very different reality. Internal documents are being softened, risk assessments edited, and critical warnings vanish between the docks and Westminster. One experienced officer described the system as rigged to avoid embarrassment, rather than to protect the country. Another put it bluntly, if the public saw the actual figures, Downing Street wouldn't last the week. This is why the current moment is so explosive, not because small boats are arriving. The country is already aware of that. But because the personnel tasked with securing Britain's borders believe the government is actively concealing the magnitude of the collapse. This is not a labor dispute. This is not a strike over pay. This is a revolt. A mutiny led by officers who say they are being forced to operate amid a crisis while pretending it does not exist. They warn that the Channel is no longer just a migration route. It has become an open corridor controlled by smugglers who are outpacing policy enforcement and political honesty, while the Home Office insists that everything remains manageable. Dover personnel report the opposite. The situation is deteriorating. The front line is exhausted and the public is being shielded from the truth. Before we go any further, take a moment to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps us continue reporting stories that those in power would rather remain hidden. Today, we break down the growing mutiny inside Britain's border system and why the officers guarding the coast now see the real threat not as the boats, but as the cover-up. The first signs of cracks within Britain's border system didn't appear in headlines or leaked statistics. They came from the tired faces at Dover from officers who say they've watched the crisis escalate in real time while Westminster insists everything is stable. What pushed them to the brink wasn't a single dramatic incident. It was the accumulation, the constant, grinding pressure of seeing boats arrive faster than they could be processed, watching detention rooms overflow, and seeing exhausted officers pulled from rest shifts just to keep the port functioning, at even a minimal level. For months, those working the Channel have said the same thing: nothing about this feels manageable anymore. One senior officer described the night shift atmosphere as a rolling emergency that never ends. Another said morale began to collapse the moment they realized the official statistics released to the public barely resembled the reality they faced each day. At Dover, the breaking point became impossible to ignore. Officers recount nights when boats arrived one after another, often before the previous group had even been processed. They described disembarkation zones so overwhelmed that staff had to triage migrants in improvised spaces because standard facilities were already full. They speak of colleagues collapsing from exhaustion, only to be asked to return within hours because no one else was available to cover the shift. None of this matched the controlled, orderly system ministers claim exists. It resembled a system trying to hold back a flood with sandbags made of paperwork. The real change came when officers began comparing notes not on the crossings themselves, but on what happened after the reports were submitted. Internal documents were rewritten, sections removed, risk assessments softened, not mistakes, but patterns. It was like watching the truth slowly vanish. One officer said the front line had suspected it for months, but when the edits became so predictable that officers could guess which warnings would be removed before the documents even reached senior management, frustration transformed into something else: mutiny. That was when the letter began circulating quietly at first, shared among trusted colleagues late at night on personal devices rather than work accounts. A letter stating, in essence, that we cannot perform our duties honestly if the truth is being erased. Signatures multiplied not from activists, but from career officers. People who had spent years in freezing winds on the Channel. People who believed in the mission. People who now say they feel complicit in a cover-up they never agreed to. Parents worry about schools. Drivers worry about roads. But at the border, officers worry about something far larger: the country losing control of its coastline, while pretending all is fine. By the time Border Force leadership finally noticed the number of signatures on that letter, it was no longer a protest. It had become a warning, a declaration that the front line had reached its breaking point. For Britain, the real question is no longer whether migration is increasing, It is whether the people protecting the border still believe the system is honest enough to function. What pushed nearly 2,000 Border Force officers to sign the same secret letter wasn't ideology. It was what they observed behind closed doors in briefing rooms, in internal memos, and in conversations management begged them not to repeat. Inside Dover's main operations hub, officers describe a culture of enforced optimism. Senior figures insist the system is under control while frontline staff watch boats land faster than they can process fingerprints. One officer said the moment he realized something had fundamentally shifted was when a supervisor whispered, "If you write the real numbers, they'll just change them upstairs." This wasn't speculation. Staff could see their own reports after they had passed through the Home Office pipeline. Paragraphs were missing. Risk warnings were softened. Estimates were replaced with figures that made nightly totals appear far less alarming. One officer joked darkly that data accuracy had turned into a game of who could make chaos look like routine administration. Conversations inside staff rooms grew sharper. Experienced officers, people who had spent years on the channel, began saying the quiet part aloud. If the public knew what was really happening out there, Westminster would be in crisis. Tensions reached a peak during a closed-door meeting earlier this winter. Officers were told to avoid over-escalating incident logs, to maintain cautious language, and most explosively, to ensure references to migrant surges were contextualized to prevent misinterpretation. Several officers walked out. One later said it felt like being ordered to keep your eyes open but report as if they were closed. It was no longer about workload. It was about integrity and fear that if something went catastrophically wrong, the blame would fall on the port staff, not the decision-makers in London. Border Force personnel described nights when officers physically argued with command about shutting intake zones that were already over capacity. Some arrived for shift changes only to find there were no breaks because the overnight team had not received any. Others stopped counting the number of migrants processed per hour because the numbers had become politically inconvenient. That was when the idea of the letter resurfaced, a document drafted months earlier, but abandoned because no one believed the system could ever deteriorate this far. This time, signatures poured in not from new recruits, but from veterans, supervisors, processing officers, maritime crew, and senior watch managers. People who had always defended the mission suddenly said they could no longer sign off on reports they believed misrepresented the truth. One officer recounted watching a younger colleague break down in the locker room after being reprimanded for describing a night surge as unmanageable. Management later revised it to high but stable inflow, a rewrite that felt too many like a slap in the face. The breaking point came when an internal alert circulated privately among senior staff, warning that several operational zones were at imminent risk of losing functional control. The version sent to the Home Office removed that phrase. Officers say that was when they realized the issue wasn't merely pressure. It was deliberate concealment. So they signed quietly, carefully, deliberately. What the letter states is simple, that Border Force cannot continue operating under a system where frontline realities are softened, rewritten, or buried. That public safety is at risk when political sensitivity overrides operational truth, and that officers will not remain silent while the coastline becomes a numbers game controlled from Westminster. Internally, the atmosphere has turned icy. Managers are now pretending the situation is under control, but staff describe a workplace where trust has evaporated, and whisper networks have replaced official briefings. Some officers say they now share information off the books because they do not trust what will be recorded formally. One long-serving officer summarized the mood in a sentence that is already echoed across multiple ports: "We're not mutinying against Britain. We're mutinying against the lies." And that, more than anything, explains why this crisis is spreading not out of rebellion, but out of a belief that the truth is no longer reaching the institutions meant to act on it. For months, the public was told the migrant situation along the south coast was manageable, that Border Force capacity was stable, and that arrival numbers were trending downward. But inside Dover, officers say the story presented to Westminster no longer matched the reality unfolding at sea or on the docks. The first red flags appeared when nightly tallies began shrinking not at the coastline, but on paper. Boats officers counted as carrying 50 passengers were logged the next morning as 32. A night in which every holding room was overwhelmed was officially described as routine volume. Staff initially assumed someone had made clerical errors. Then it happened again and again and again. Officers soon recognized a pattern. Raw reports were left accurate, but by the time they arrived in London, they had been softened, edited, and trimmed into something more politically palatable. One officer described watching his own report return unrecognizable, stripped of urgency, and rewritten as if the situation were completely under control. Another compared the process to sanitizing a crime scene before anyone else arrives. Risk assessments warning that migrant inflows had exceeded safe thresholds were returned with entire sentences removed. References to coordinated groups arriving on multiple boats groups officers believed were organized vanished entirely. By the time the documents reached senior officials, internal briefings that described nights as unsustainable mysteriously reappeared in national summaries as moderate operational strain. What frustrated officers most wasn't the workload. It was the sense that the truth itself had become something to be managed. Attempts by analytics teams to match operational logs with government-issued figures failed repeatedly. Entries were missing. Dates didn't line up. Headcounts dropped inexplicably between ports and London. One senior staff member said it felt like chasing numbers rewritten to fit a story, rather than reflecting reality. Then came the briefing that changed everything. A confidential report circulated internally warned that migrant arrivals had already surpassed long-term capacity forecasts, not potential projections, but the present reality. The version presented to ministers removed that line entirely, replacing it with a statement claiming arrivals remained within acceptable thresholds. To the officers who saw the original, it felt like someone had pulled the fire alarm only for the Home Office to cover the siren with a blanket. The final blow came as a quiet internal email advising senior staff to exercise caution in reports that might reinforce negative narratives about migrant arrivals. To officers on the ground, the message was unmistakable. The problem wasn't operational, it was political. Many challenged their superiors directly. The answers were always the same: context, presentation, avoiding public panic. Words that reinforced what they already suspected. The government wasn't merely failing to manage the border, it was failing to be honest about it. By the time 1,900 officers signed the mutiny letter, their frustration had gone beyond workload or safety concerns. It centered on credibility, of feeling that they were being asked to protect a coastline, while the government controlled the story. As one experienced officer explained, if the real numbers were released tomorrow, the nation would see we lost control months ago. And that is the reality Westminster fears most. Tonight's report leaves Britain facing a question no minister will address. If the officers defending our coastline claim the truth is being concealed, what else is this government keeping from the public? A mutiny involving 1,900 Border Force staff isn't merely a disagreement. It's a bright warning signal. And if those on the front line no longer trust the system, why should citizens? So tell me in the comments, is Britain's border still secure, or has it already been breached? Your input will shape what we uncover next.